The arena buzzed with an energy so thick it felt almost tangible. A storm of voices swirling beneath the high ceilings, waiting for the impossible to unfold. No one had ever expected this fight to happen, not in a million years. Two titans from completely different worlds, separated by eras, rules, and styles, now stood on the verge of making combat sports history. It was the kind of matchup that sounded more like a fan's wild fantasy than an actual sanctioned bout. But tonight, it was real. Khabib, the undefeated mauler from the world of MMA against Holyfield, the heavyweight boxing legend who had fought the best of the best. There were questions, debates, and endless speculation leading up to this moment. Would Khabib's relentless grappling style translate to the ring, or would Holyfield's decades of experience and raw punching power overwhelm him before he even had a chance to adapt? The buildup had been nothing short of electric. Some said Khabib was stepping into territory where he didn't belong, that no amount of training could prepare him for the sheer power and precision of a boxer like Holyfield. Others argued that Khabib's relentless pressure and ability to dictate the pace of a fight would force Holyfield into unfamiliar waters, making this more than just a test of skill. It was a collision of mindsets, of worlds colliding in a way that few had ever dared to imagine. But now, all the speculation, all the theories, meant nothing. The time for words had passed. The two men stood in their corners, their expressions unreadable, their focus absolute. A few weeks ago, the very idea of this matchup had sent shockwaves through the fight world. Khabib had long maintained that his time in professional competition was over, that he had nothing left to prove. Holyfield, a warrior who had already carved his name into the annals of boxing history, wasn't supposed to be stepping into the ring again, especially not against an opponent who had never fought a professional boxing match in his life. But something had changed. A challenge had been issued. A question had been raised that neither man could ignore. Could an elite grappler, a fighter trained in suffocating pressure and ground dominance, hold his own against a pure striker with years of experience in the squared circle? The lights dimmed for a moment, then exploded back to life, bathing the arena in a golden glow. The air was thick with anticipation, a collective breath being held by millions watching around the world. This wasn't just another fight. This was history in the making, a clash that would be dissected, analyzed, and debated for years to come. As the referee called both fighters to the center of the ring, the difference in their styles was obvious. Holyfield, taller, broader, his stance radiating the confidence of a man who had exchanged blows with the greatest of all time. Khabib, compact, coiled like a spring, his eyes locked onto his opponent with an intensity that sent chills down the spine of anyone watching. The touch of gloves was brief, almost dismissive. There was no animosity, no bad blood, just the understanding that what was about to happen would answer questions that had lingered for far too long. The bell rang. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Then, the fight began. Khabib moved first, circling cautiously, his movements sharper and more deliberate than in any MMA bout. Holyfield didn't chase. He stood firm, watching, calculating, waiting for the slightest opening. The difference in styles was evident from the start. Khabib, accustomed to closing the distance quickly in a cage, now had to find a way to engage without exposing himself to Holyfield's devastating counters. But this was no ordinary fight, and neither man was willing to rush into a mistake. A jab flicked out from Holyfield, testing, measuring. Khabib slipped just outside its reach, his reaction time impeccable. But the real test was yet to come. He had trained for this, spent months refining his striking, working tirelessly to bridge the gap between his natural instincts and the demands of boxing. Yet now, under the bright lights, Facing a legend with nothing to lose and everything to prove, the true challenge was unfolding in real time. Then it happened, a split-second exchange that sent a ripple through the crowd. Holyfield stepped in with a lightning-fast combination, a left hook grazing Khabib's guard, followed by a right hand that came dangerously close to landing flush. Khabib reacted instantly, his footwork carrying him out of range, his expression unchanged. But Holyfield had seen something, a momentary hesitation, a fraction of an opening. The crowd roared as the intensity of the fight escalated. Khabib adjusted, his movements more aggressive now, feinting, testing his own angles. He wasn't just here to survive, he was here to prove something. Holyfield, however, had his own statement to make. As the seconds ticked away, the tension thickened. The next exchange could change everything. Then, in an instant, Holyfield shifted his weight, setting up for a punch that could end it all right then and there if it landed. Khabib saw it coming, but was it too late? The moment seemed to stretch, frozen in time, as Holyfield's fist cut through the air like a missile locked onto its target. His right hand, a weapon sharpened by years of experience, was aimed to end the debate in one decisive strike. But just as the crowd gasped, anticipating impact, Khabib reacted. His instincts, honed through countless battles inside the cage, took over. He dipped just enough to let the punch sail past, his reflexes carrying him out of immediate danger. The entire arena held its breath. It was a razor-thin margin, a fraction of a second that separated him from disaster. But even as he evaded the blow, there was something unsettling about Holyfield's expression. He hadn't thrown the punch just to land it. He had been testing Khabib, studying his reaction, calculating his next move. The opening round had been a chess match, each fighter gathering data, probing for weaknesses. But now the tone was shifting. Holyfield, realizing his opponent wouldn't fold easily, adjusted his approach. He started to press forward with calculated aggression, cutting off angles, forcing Khabib to work harder for space. Khabib, in turn, maintained his composure, staying disciplined, avoiding reckless engagements. He had been here before, in wars of attrition, where patience meant survival. But this was different. He couldn't shoot for a takedown, couldn't drag the fight into his world. He was bound by the rules of the ring, playing Holyfield's game, and every exchange was a high-stakes gamble. Outside the ropes, the world watched in awe. Analysts had spent weeks arguing about what Khabib would bring to the table, whether his pressure could translate, whether his granite chin would hold up against heavyweight power. Inside the ring, those theories were being tested in real time. Holyfield, even at this stage in his career, still carried the weight of a champion, the muscle memory of a man who had weathered storms against some of the hardest hitters in history. Khabib, despite his combat pedigree, was a newcomer in this realm, and every second inside the ring was a lesson he couldn't afford to learn the hard way. Behind the scenes, the forces that had orchestrated this fight were just as intriguing as the battle itself. What had convinced Khabib, a man who had walked away from competition on his own terms, to return for this? And why had Holyfield, who had already cemented his place in history, accepted a fight against someone whose strengths lay in an entirely different domain? The answers weren't simple, and the truth stretched beyond what the public had been told. Some believed it was legacy. Others whispered of an underlying challenge, a private conversation that had ignited something in both men, a test neither could walk away from. Among the audience, a mix of fight veterans, industry insiders, and former champions studied every move with quiet intensity. Some were here for the spectacle, but others saw something deeper, an unspoken battle not just of skill, but of eras, of ideologies. Was this a symbol of the old guard refusing to step aside, or the rise of a new form of combat excellence? There were no clear answers yet, and that uncertainty only added to the electricity in the air. As the fight progressed, Khabib started making subtle adjustments. His movement became more fluid, his timing more precise. He wasn't simply reacting anymore. He was beginning to anticipate, to read Holyfield's rhythm. The shift was almost imperceptible, but those watching closely could see it. Holyfield noticed too. The briefest flicker of recognition crossed his face as Khabib countered a jab with his own, a sharp, well-placed shot that landed clean. It wasn't a power punch, but it carried a message he wasn't just here to survive. But Holyfield wasn't done testing him. With an almost imperceptible shift in weight, he feinted, drawing Khabib into range, and then like lightning unleashed another devastating right hand. This time, there was no room to escape completely. The punch grazed Khabib's temple, not enough to knock him down, but enough to send a warning through his body to remind him exactly who he was dealing with. A lesser fighter might have crumbled. Khabib steadied himself, blinked away the brief fog and nodded, acknowledging the impact but refusing to back down. The crowd roared as the tension climbed higher. Neither man had landed anything fight-ending, but every exchange felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. The fight had reached a dangerous tipping point. Holyfield was beginning to see gaps in Khabib's defense, small cracks that, with the right timing, could lead to a decisive moment. Khabib, on the other hand, was finding his own answers, recognizing that speed, precision, and strategy could be his keys to survival. But just as the momentum seemed to shift, an unexpected development threw everything into question. Something about Holyfield's stance changed subtle, but enough for trained eyes to notice. He took half a step back, resetting, his breath a fraction heavier than before. Khabib saw it too. Was it an opening? Or was it a trap? The answer would come in an instant, and with it, the next seismic moment in this unprecedented battle. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the crowd as Holyfield hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, his stance shifting in a way that only the most trained eyes could detect. Khabib, ever the predator in his own domain, saw it instantly. A hesitation, a breath too heavy, a moment of recalibration. Something was off. But was this an opportunity or a deception? Holyfield was a master of drawing his opponents in, making them believe they had an opening before punishing them for their assumptions. Khabib knew better than to rush blindly, but the temptation was there. He feinted forward, testing, gauging the reaction. Holyfield held his ground. The atmosphere tightened, the energy inside the arena sharpening into something almost unbearable. Then, in an instant, the unexpected happened. Holyfield's right foot wavered slightly as he stepped back, a motion almost too subtle to notice. To the untrained eye, it was nothing. But to Khabib, it was a signal something was wrong. A veteran like Holyfield never made unnecessary movements, never retreated without reason. Had he miscalculated? Was fatigue setting in? Or was there something else, something deeper that even he hadn't anticipated? Khabib's instincts screamed at him to act. He surged forward, not recklessly, but with the precision of a man who knew exactly when to pounce. His left hand fired out, not with knockout power, but with speed and intent, aiming to test Holyfield's response. But what came next wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of countering, Holyfield did something he had never done before in his career. He stumbled. Not a slip, not a feint, but a real, genuine loss of balance. The crowd gasped as his footing faltered for the briefest of moments. And then, just as quickly as it happened, he corrected, planting his feet, his expression unreadable. But the damage was done. Khabib had seen it. More importantly, Holyfield knew he had seen it. For the first time in the fight, doubt crept into the eyes of the legendary boxer. The invincible aura, the unshakable presence there was a crack. A small one, but a crack nonetheless. Khabib didn't celebrate, didn't react outwardly, but inside, he understood what this meant. He wasn't just surviving in the ring with a legend, he was making him second-guess himself. The rhythm of the fight had changed. In the corner, Holyfield's team exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't part of the plan. They had accounted for Khabib's unorthodox movement, his ability to adapt, but what they hadn't accounted for was the possibility that Holyfield's body might not cooperate. His mind was still razor-sharp, his technique flawless, but there was something beneath the surface, something no one had been willing to say out loud before this fight. Age. Time. The one opponent no fighter could ever truly defeat. But Holyfield wasn't done yet. His pride, his experience, his very identity as a warrior wouldn't allow it. He squared his shoulders, narrowed his eyes, and made a decision. If his body was beginning to betray him, then he would have to win this fight another way. No more waiting. No more testing. He would take the risk. Khabib barely had time to register the shift before it happened. Holyfield exploded forward, closing the distance faster than he had all night, throwing a hook with full commitment. It wasn't just a punch. It was a statement. If Khabib had sensed weakness, if he had started to believe the fight was slipping in his favor, this was Holyfield's way of reminding him exactly who he was dealing with. Khabib barely managed to get his guard up in time, absorbing the force of the impact, but the sheer power behind it sent him reeling a step back. The arena erupted. This was the battle they had come to see. Two men pushing themselves past limits, forcing each other into deep waters. Holyfield pressed forward, unleashing another barrage, his years of experience screaming at him that now was the time to take control. Khabib, gritting his teeth, weathered the assault, moving, dodging, absorbing just enough to stay in the fight without allowing himself to be overwhelmed. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Khabib was no longer just defending. He was calculating. He had seen the stumble. He had felt the force behind Holyfield's punches. And he had realized something that no one else had, not the commentators, not the crowd, maybe not even Holyfield himself. The punches were still sharp, still powerful. But they weren't as fast as they had been in the opening round. The legend was slowing down. Khabib adjusted his strategy immediately. He didn't need to win this fight with a single strike. He just needed to drag it into the deep rounds. He needed to make Holyfield chase him, force the older fighter to work harder, to exhaust his reserves, until that slight hesitation became something bigger. It was a risky gamble because Holyfield still had the power to end it in an instant, but it was Khabib's best chance at turning the tide completely in his favor. The next exchange came like a flash of lightning. Khabib, rather than retreating, stayed just inside the pocket, forcing Holyfield to engage in ways that drained his energy even faster. He slipped just out of reach, forcing Holyfield to miss by inches. Every punch that whiffed the air was another drop of energy lost. The tension inside the arena became suffocating. The momentum of the fight was shifting yet again, but no one could predict what would come next. Then, just as the round neared its final seconds, something completely unexpected happened. Holyfield, growing visibly frustrated, threw another massive right hand. Khabib dodged, but at the very last moment, he felt something collide with his shoulder. Not a clean shot, not enough to drop him, but enough to throw off his balance just slightly. And in that split second of instability, Holyfield took his chance. A left hook came out of nowhere, landing flush. Khabib's head snapped to the side. The crowd roared in shock. His legs wobbled, his vision blurred for just a moment. Holyfield, seeing the opening, rushed forward to finish it. But as he did, something else happened. His own foot caught awkwardly against the canvas. His knee buckled, his balance failed him. And before he could even register it, he was falling. The bell rang at that exact moment. The round was over. But the sight that followed was something no one in the world could have predicted. Khabib, rocked but still standing. Holyfield on one knee. A legend, brought down not by a punch, but by something else entirely. The referee stepped between them, assessing the situation. The entire stadium fell into a stunned silence. What had just happened? Had Holyfield fallen on his own? Was Khabib more hurt than he let on? And most importantly, when the next round began, what would happen next? The moment stretched in eerie silence, the kind that only comes when the impossible has just unfolded. Holyfield, the war-hardened legend, down on one knee, not from a punch, not from a knockdown, but from something deeper, something even he wasn't ready to admit. Across from him, Khabib, swaying slightly, his mind still recalibrating after that last hook, forced himself to stand tall. The referee hovered between them, hands ready, eyes darting, unsure whether he needed to make a call or let the moment play out. The bell had saved them both, but it had also frozen them in a moment neither could ignore. Holyfield's breathing was deep, measured. He knew what had happened, even if the crowd hadn't fully processed it yet. His knee, the same one that had carried him through wars, the same one that had felt the strain of time, had betrayed him at the worst possible moment. He wanted to rise instantly, to erase the image from the minds of everyone watching, but he knew better. Any sudden movement, any attempt to power through without assessing the damage, could end the fight for real. So instead, he did something uncharacteristic. He waited. Khabib, on the other hand, wasn't celebrating. There was no smug satisfaction in his expression, no rush of confidence. He had been rocked, had tasted Holyfield's power, had felt the weight of every second inside that ring. And yet, the truth was undeniable. He had lasted. He had taken the best Holyfield could offer and was still standing. But more importantly, he had seen something no one else had seen until now. The referee signaled the end of the round, giving Holyfield the time he needed to return to his corner. His team rushed in, eyes filled with concern, whispering words only he could hear. "It's fine," he muttered, shaking his head, but the tension in their faces told him they didn't believe it. The camera angles hadn't caught everything, but those closest to the ring had seen the way he'd gone down. The whispers were already beginning. Had age finally caught up? Had Khabib, with his relentless pressure, forced the legend into a fight his body could no longer sustain? In the opposite corner, Khabib's team didn't celebrate either. They had seen the left hook, seen how close it had come to ending the fight. But they had also seen something else, the slight hesitation in Holyfield's movement. The shift in momentum that had nothing to do with Khabib's skills and everything to do with time itself. His coach leaned in, whispering, "He's slowing down. You see it, don't you?" Khabib didn't nod, didn't confirm, but he had already made up his mind. When the next round began, the energy in the arena had transformed. The roars were still there, the tension still thick, but there was an underlying uncertainty now. Both men had taken damage. Both men had shown vulnerability. And for the first time in the fight, no one knew who had the true advantage. Holyfield came out sharp, his hands high, his expression unreadable, but there was a slight stiffness in his movement. He wasn't stepping in as aggressively, wasn't pressing forward with the same level of dominance. He was protecting something, and Khabib saw it. What happened next wasn't an explosion of violence, not a dramatic knockout or an overwhelming assault. Instead, it was something more methodical, more calculated. Khabib, reading every movement with precision, started to control the pace. He forced Holyfield to move, to react, to exert himself in ways that drained him even further. He stayed just out of reach, forcing Holyfield to throw punches that didn't land clean. Every miss was another reminder of what was slipping away. Then came the moment that no one could deny. Holyfield stepped forward, planted his feet, and threw a right hand meant to end it all. But this time, Khabib wasn't there. He had already moved, already seen it coming. And before Holyfield could reset, Khabib landed a counter. Not a knockout punch, not a devastating strike, just a perfectly timed, clean shot that rocked Holyfield's balance once again. The great champion stumbled, not from force, but from something far more final. His own body had betrayed him. The referee saw it. The corner saw it. And Holyfield himself, in that fraction of a second, knew it. He caught himself before he could go down, steadied himself on instinct, but the damage wasn't external. It was the realization, the moment where a fighter knows that no matter how strong the mind is, the body will eventually decide for itself. Khabib didn't rush forward to finish him. He didn't throw reckless punches. He simply stood there, watching, waiting. Holyfield raised his gloves, nodded once, acknowledging the moment. The referee stepped between them, glancing at Holyfield, looking for a signal. And then, before anyone else could make the decision for him, the legend took a deep breath and did something no one had expected. He took a step back, and then another. And then he slowly lowered his gloves. The arena erupted, not in disappointment, but in understanding. This wasn't a loss. This wasn't a defeat. This was a choice. Holyfield, the warrior who had defied time for so long, knew that if he continued, it wouldn't be the fight that ended him. It would be his own body. And rather than let that moment come against his will, he made the decision himself. The referee waved it off. The fight was over. Khabib, still standing, still processing what had just happened, didn't raise his hands in victory. Instead, he walked forward, closing the distance, looking Holyfield in the eye. And in that moment, in front of millions watching, the two men shared an understanding that no one else could ever truly grasp. As the commentators scrambled to find words, as the crowd's chants filled the air, Khabib did something that solidified what this fight had really been about. He extended his hand. Not as a victor, not as a challenger, but as a man who had stepped into another world and had been tested beyond his limits. Holyfield, without hesitation, took it.